Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that that so many people are here to take advantage of this wonderful panel. I'm David Jensen. I'm a professor of computer science and director of the Computational Social Science Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I will be serving as host for today's panel. Today's event is one of a series of events convened and sponsored by CSSI as part of our mission of enhancing the research activities of UMass faculty focused on how computational methods and models can aid the study of the social world. As with nearly all academic disciplines and research areas, definitions can help people outside a field understand what it is that we study and how we study it. And they can also help members of the field itself conceive of what we do in new ways. To help us better understand computational social science, we've invited three outstanding pioneers in the field. Sandra Matz is the David Zaloznik Associate Professor at Columbia Business School. She combines methodologies from psychology and computer science, including machine learning, experimental designs, online surveys, and field studies to explore the relationships between people's psychological characteristics and the digital footprints that they leave in the digital environment. She has been named one of Data IQ's 100 most influential people in data-driven marketing, and she was recognized as one of the 30 top thinkers under 30 by the Pacific Standard magazine. Among others, her work has been cited in articles in The Independent, the BBC, CNBC, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. Sendhil Mullainathan is the Roman Family University Professor of Computation and Behavioral Science at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. His current research uses machine learning to understand complex problems in human behavior, social policy, and especially medicine, where computational techniques have the potential to uncover biomedical insights from large-scale health data. In past work, he's combined insights from economics and behavioral science with causal inference tools, lab, field, and natural experiments to study social problems such as discrimination and poverty. He is a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant, and he writes regularly for the New York Times. Duncan Watts is the Stevens University Professor and 23rd Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where he holds faculty appointments in the Department of Computer and Information Science, the Annenberg School of Communications, and the Operations, Information, and Decisions Department in the Wharton School. His research on network science and computational social science has appeared in a wide range of journals, including Science and Nature, and he is frequently cited in popular media outlets. He is also the author of 3 books, including 6 Degrees, The Science of a Connected Age, and Everything is Obvious Once You Know the Answer. Prior to his faculty appointment, he was a principal research scientist at Yahoo Research and a principal researcher at Microsoft Research. On behalf of CSSI and the University of Massachusetts, I'd like to thank each of our panelists for joining us today. It's a real honor and a pleasure to have you with us. We'll begin today's discussion with comments from each of our panelists. They were nice enough yesterday to self-organize a bit and have agreed to start with a presentation from Duncan, followed by comments from Sandra and Sendhil. Then we will open it up for questions from the audience. So due to the strong interest in the panel, we'll be using the Zoom interface to field questions. So please submit your questions at any time during the session and feel free to upvote questions that you see there already, and that should be visible to you. Upvote those questions that you're particularly interested in hearing the panelists answer. With that, I will turn things over to Duncan to start us off. Duncan?
Thanks, David. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So I just wanted to start off by making some remarks about my own personal perspective on computational social science and how we got to where we are and perhaps where we're going. And so just to kind of answer directly or pose an answer directly to the topic of the panel, and I wrote this slide before I was invited to this session. The high level definition of what computational social science is really driven by the data. that we've sort of seen over the last 10 or 20 years a revolution in the world outside of science, really in the realm of digital technology and communications, whereby billions of people around the world are doing things they used to do in an offline analog way in a digital way. And all of you know all of those things that we're doing, communicating with each other, posting media online, consuming media online, engaging in e-commerce, etc. And all of these activities are spewing off vast amounts of data that is intrinsically of interest to social science, but poses all kinds of methodological challenges and indeed computational challenges to understand and make sense of. In addition to that, the web has also dramatically changed the way that we think about and can do experiments, both traditional lab style experiments that can now be done in virtual environments, and also field experiments that can be done on digital platforms, at vastly greater scales than we're used to in the past. And so the combination of these two sort of buckets of capabilities is sort of roughly what I think of when I think of computational social science. And what's important about it, from my point of view, is it's not just that we're getting more data or that we're getting it more cheaply, but that this change in scale is really bringing about a change in type, which allows us to both think about new approaches to questions that we've been interested in for many years in the social sciences. And certainly all of my research is based on questions that have been around for decades, if not centuries. And also it allows us to ask new questions entirely that we might not have thought to ask absent this technology. So a very brief history of computational social science. Back in the 1990s, there was indeed a field called computational social science. It meant something very different back then. It was sort of a pre-web era when people were very excited about the possibility of computers and computer simulation to develop theory. And so there was a whole community of agent-based modelers who called themselves computational social scientists, and indeed that community still exists and are still advancing this particular field. But as I mentioned, in the 2000s, other things started to happen in the world. Facebook was launched, Amazon created Mechanical Turk, 2006, Twitter was founded. And so around about the mid-2000s, we started to see papers like the ones on the right-hand side here, the first three of which were all published in 2006, where the phrase computational social science wasn't used to describe what they were doing. But when we look back on them, we would say these were kind of early instances of computational social science that were exploiting this new type of data in novel ways, or creating experiments that were, extensions of what we could have done in a physical lab. And then in 2009, this fourth paper that is pictured over on the right-hand side was published by David Lazar and a bunch of colleagues. And in that paper, they really, defined or really redefined computational social science, not as agent-based modeling, but as the way that I just described it on the previous slide, as quantitative modeling of digital traces. And this paper was enormously influential. It's now been cited over 3,000 times, and it really sort of put a stake in the ground, and everybody, over the course of the next few years, sort of gradually gravitated towards this new usage of the term. And so in 2012, when I joined Microsoft, we created a computational social science group. And I think that was probably the first research group that was formally called computational social science in this new sense. And now there are many such groups. In 2015, a few years later, the first international conference on computational social science happened in Helsinki. 2017, the first Summer Institute on Computational Social Science was held at Princeton, and now there's about 20 of these happening around the world every year. And then last year, David Lazar and a bunch of different colleagues got together and published a follow-up, also in Science, sort of reviewing the progress that had been made and talking about some challenges. So there has been a lot of exciting progress. It's been a great period of time to be sort of getting in at the ground level and doing this kind of work. And I think we've sort of demonstrated to ourselves that there's something really there, right? That for all of the challenges that big data has, and there have been numerous articles written that are critical of some of the hype and reason, there are definitely questions that we can answer or even ask that would have been very difficult or impossible to ask previously, just because of the nature, the granularity and the scale of the data. We can devise new methods for causal inference. We can look at networks on the scale of entire large organizations of hundreds of thousands of people. We can describe in very granular detail the trajectory or the shape, the structure of online cascades of information. We can measure media consumption over a large population for a long period of time in very precise detail. So this kind of data is really driving new research questions and shedding light on old research questions. And at the same time, I think the virtual labs revolution, maybe is happening a little bit more slowly, but is I think starting to really gather steam, where we're able to design experiments that would have been sort of inconceivable in a physical lab space, or maybe they would have been conceivable, but they would have been practically impossible to run. So we can run experiments that span weeks or longer. We can have very complex, realistic designs where people are solving problems that are essentially identical to real-world problems that they solve outside of the lab. We can run experiments that are involve populations that are thousands or tens of thousands of people, which is far more than you could fit into a physical laboratory. So this sort of feasible space of experimental designs is growing thanks to these virtual capabilities. So if you sort of look at this little schematic up here and think about the space of all possible experiments compressed into these 3 dimensions of scale, duration, and realism, the real world is sort of out here somewhere where we have large populations interacting in complicated ways over long periods of time, and the history of behavioral experiments in labs is somewhere down near the origin, where you have small numbers of people interacting in fairly simple ways over short periods of time. And what we want to do is try to push this red boundary out further into the space, so that we are getting closer and closer to the kinds of things that we really care about. In addition to the research, there's been a lot that's happening in terms of sort of institutional development, and that has been, I think, really accelerated by this great conference, the International Conference for Computational Social Science, which is the 7th instantiation of which will be happening this year in Zurich. I think it's going to be an online conference again, but hopefully one day we'll get back to being in person. This is a network from 2 years ago, 2019, showing all of the disciplines present at the conference and where people came from before they started to identify themselves as computational social scientists. And you can see that it really is, sort of succeeding as an interdisciplinary field where a very diverse range of people are coming together and exchanging ideas and methods. And having been at these conferences, for several years now, I really felt that year things had started to gel, and they really felt like there was a community of people who were, in some sense, native computational social scientists. So this is sort of a really exciting development. there's been a lot more interest, a rapidly growing interest in computational social science among different conferences, but also journals. There's an increasing number of research centers and degree programs, including at the University of Chicago and at Columbia, where people are actively training in computational social science and identifying as computational social scientists. And finally, and very importantly, there are jobs. And many of these jobs now are postdoc level, but increasingly we're seeing faculty, tenure track faculty jobs that are being explicitly advertised as computational social science jobs. So this has all really happened in the last decade, and it's been quite surprising to me how rapid the uptake has been, which is super encouraging. That said, I think, and I'll try not to spend too much time on these challenges so we can talk about them in the discussion. I think that we've sort of got to a point now where we've sort of, we're a real thing. Computational social science is a real thing. There's a real community. There's some successes that we can put up on the board. But now we have to take seriously that there are some big challenges that we need to be also taking seriously. And I'll sort of divide these into research practices, data, and rethinking the model of social science. So on research practices, I'm sure that you're all aware that there's been a growing concern in the social sciences and in psychology in particular about reproducibility and replicability of findings and the prevalence of false positives, which are generated by a combination of misapplication of standard null hypothesis testing, and perhaps even more profoundly about the exploitation of researcher degrees of freedom. That effectively, in the process of going from your initial scientific hypothesis to some particular statistical test that you perform on some particular data set, you have to make a bunch of choices, potentially dozens of choices or more, about how to design your experiment, how to collect your data, how to handle outliers and exclusions, what kinds of tests to perform, what kind of model to run. So many choices to make, and you're not necessarily making these choices in an unbiased way. And so the net result is that it's very easy to convince yourself that you have a positive finding because that's what you get rewarded for, when in fact you're simply mining noise in your data. And so this is something that has been written about a lot in the context of small N experiments in psychology labs. And I think the point that we should really try to internalize is that the same problem applies even to very large N machine learning exercises. So even though the context in that most computational social science scientists operate in is very different from the one where this reproducibility crisis began, it turns out we basically have a version of the same problem where researcher degrees of freedom are still present, and it's possible, and we showed this in a paper a few years ago, to actually take the same model and fit it on the same data set and generate many different results, all of which individually would seem totally reasonable, but lead to qualitatively different conclusions. And so, we have, this is, exactly a sort of garden of forking paths problem here that people have written about. So I think, we also have to worry about reproducibility, and we also have to worry about generalizability, and we're not out of the woods just because we're doing machine learning. And, another version of this that makes things worse is that, that many of the problems that we are interested in involve people, and even though our publications may sit still, people do not. And so even if you do everything right, and you do, out of sample cross-validation, et cetera, a year later, 2 years later, the world has in effect changed, and the very same algorithm will not perform nearly as well as it did in your initial data. And that has practical issues, as David Lazar and colleagues showed with the Google Flu Trends algorithm, but also it has sort of deep substantive implications for what we have actually answered when we answer a research question, right? And this is something that we discovered inadvertently a few years ago when we were using email data to try to predict employee satisfaction in annual surveys at Microsoft. And we got some really promising results, and then we decided that we would replicate the entire study the following year with new data, and it turned out that all of our results went away. That was distressing for us because we had done twice as much work and now we didn't have a publishable result. But it also made us think that this is probably happening more than we realize. So what can we do? There are a bunch of solutions that have been proposed. Pre-registration is one of them. Out of sample prediction is another one. We can definitely talk about this in the discussion. All of them are easier said than done, in part because we have all of these sort of misaligned incentives in the publication system. Another big area of concern is that even though we have a lot of great data that we didn't used to have, in some sense we don't have enough and we don't have the right data. And part of that is because we haven't yet figured out how to collaborate with industry, and that remains a big problem. And part of it is because even if we could figure out how to collaborate with industry, we still wouldn't be out of the woods because there's a lot of questions that we would like to answer that are not necessarily the kinds of questions that commercial platforms are designed to answer. And so we may need to figure out better. We certainly need to figure out better mechanisms for partnering with industry, but we also probably need to figure out better ways of building our own infrastructure to answer the questions that we care about. And then finally, I would say something that has been really a concern of mine for the last several years is, what are we trying to do when we do social science? And in practice, what we're often doing is we're writing papers and we're publishing them and we're measuring their impact by how frequently they get cited by our colleagues. And we just sort of assume that somehow all of that is going to translate into useful knowledge that has implications outside of our world. And I'm not convinced that that actually is happening, or at least not as much as it should be happening. And so I've been inspired by this model that was devised by a political scientist, Stokes, back in the 1990s, where he invented this quadrant that he called Pasteur's quadrant, where you think about science as being aligned along two dimensions. One is how use inspired is it, and the other is how much is it about basic understanding. And so we have what is we normally think of as pure basic research, where it's purely curiosity-driven research with no use case associated with it, and we have pure applied research, which is useful but not very curiosity-driven. And what he pointed out is that there is a third quadrant where you can do both at the same time, which is what he called Pasteur's quadrant. And in fact, there's lots of examples of this type of research, very often in engineering and medical science. It's not so common in the social sciences, but it could be. And I think that we have, both of the other panelists today have some experience with doing use-inspired basic science. So, I think this is something that we could, even though it's not specifically about computational social science could be an opportunity for us to do more of this style of work. So I'll stop there and thank you for listening and look forward to Sendhil and Sandra's comments.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Duncan. I'm going to take it from here. First of all, thank you, David, for putting this panel together. I think it's really amazing to see how computational social science gets a stage in a center, in a panel like this. It's really nice to see, and Duncan, you showed it on the graph. It's really nice to see how it just developed over the years and is attracting a lot more attention, a lot more people who are excited about this. So I was thinking that, because like I don't have a lot to add to the definition of computational social science. I think, Duncan, you did an amazing job at kind of walking us through the history. So what I was thinking is that maybe I could just tell you a little bit more about why I am super excited about computational social science, right? So the opportunities that I think like the field provides for kind of doing really interesting research that hopefully contributes to theory, but then is also applicable in some way. And the one thing that I thought about, and you'll see it's a bit of a stream of consciousness, and I'm super happy to dive into some of these things a little bit more in the Q&A. But for me, one of the main things that makes computational social science so appealing to me is that, so I was trained as a psychologist, is what I should say, a psychologist, and then at some point I got interested in the use of computational methods. And it's funny because we think of ourselves as behavioral scientists, right? So psychology is considered a behavioral science. I'm now in a department at the business school that's called organizational behavior. We have a group in marketing that's called consumer behavior. So there's a strong focus on this human behavior, but for most part of the history of psychology, of the history of organizational behavior, consumer behavior, it was really difficult to capture that behavior. So I like the graph that Duncan had, where it was like in the very corner, we had people come into the lab, they pressed a bunch of buttons, or we asked them survey questions where they just reflect on their experience. But it was incredibly difficult to really study people's daily experiences, right? So there's this sociological book that was written at some point. It's called A Day in a Boy's Life, where they would follow one boy over the course of 24 hours. They recorded everything. It was like 5-7 research assistants. They recorded everything that one boy did, and it turned into a book, which is amazing because you really get insights into what's happening in that boy's life, but super limited in terms of scale. And so what I think is just amazing, by kind of having these traces that people leave these days, is that we can really get an understanding of what is it that people do on a daily basis, and really owning in on this behavioral part that we all think of ourselves when it comes to social science. So I think for me, that's just, like, if we think about it conceptually, an incredible opportunity. Then there's a few other kind of points that are related to this. And one of the things that makes it so interesting for me personally is that it kind of gets rid of this very structured approach to science. So the way that I was trained as a psychologist, right, is like you read the entire literature, you come up with like your tiny niche, you develop a very well-defined theory, you develop hypotheses, and then you go out and collect data to try and kind of show that your findings are consistent with the theory. And to some extent, big data has changed that fundamentally, in the sense that right now you can still follow that model, right? So you can still develop like theories and you can base it on hypotheses. And that's oftentimes what we do, even in the world of computational social science, but you can also come from the other direction. So there's oftentimes cases where I just got my hands on a really interesting data set. So there could be GPS data, there could be credit card data. And then, like, instead of having this theory a priori, like the way that I kind of think about research is saying, okay, here's an incredible opportunity. What are some of the interesting questions that we could be asking with that data set? And oftentimes, like, especially when you have a group of people who come from different disciplines, it's a really fun exercise. Just you sit in a room, you kind of look at your data table, and then you brainstorm questions of like, what would be interesting to answer? And it's kind of coming back a little bit to Duncan's last point. I think when you look at it this way, oftentimes the question that you develop they're a little bit more focused on what is novel and how could this actually be used afterwards. So it's just a different way of thinking about how do we come up with questions, and then also how do we test them. And one of the things that I've heard a lot when I started doing this kind of work was, well, but like there's all these limitations to big data and computational social science because it's often correlational, it's not necessarily theory driven, you can't test mechanisms, it's not as controlled as our traditional lab studies. And one of the responses that I think we're seeing a lot more of, and that I think it's just like a really nice way forward if you think about replication prices, is just combining these methods, right? So if you're someone who runs experiments, I'm not saying just ditch your experiments, just focus on data, but oftentimes there's nice ways in which we can combine the two. So we can use big data and we can show that here's something that really happens out there in the real world. Even if it might only be true for the next couple of years, that's something that we should definitely test more and more. But then nobody prevents you from following up with an experiment to show that this is a causal effect, or test some of the mechanism, test some of the more subjective experiences that people have within the phenomenon that you're studying. So I think it's just this early dichotomy of you can either be an experimentalist or you can work with big data. I think that that's just a false dichotomy that we should kind of overcome to some extent. The second point, that for me is also super important, but I do think requires a little bit of rethinking in terms of how we talk about our results and in terms of how the field accepts the way that we present our findings, is the fact that oftentimes with big data, we can actually acknowledge that social phenomena are complex and complicated, right? So in our traditional lab studies, because they were based on small samples, what we were looking for were large effect sizes, or at least medium size effect sizes. And that was mostly driven by the fact that we were just limited to the pool of undergraduate students in our psych department. But what we have now, and oftentimes, like the way that I've heard people talk about it in the early stages of big data and computational social science was like, oh, you're just showing us effects. They're all significant, of course, because you have a lot of data, but they're not really meaningful because they only have an effect size of 0.1. And what does it really mean? For me, it's an incredible opportunity, right? It's so unlikely that social phenomena like well-being, decision-making, you name it, the things that social scientists are interested in, human behavior, it's noisy. It's very unlikely that these social phenomena are driven by a few extremely strong predictors. And what social science, like computational social science and big data allows you to do in a way is to look for these small puzzle pieces to the more complex overall picture. And what's nice is that the puzzle pieces might be small, and I think that's something that we should acknowledge, but oftentimes they're incredibly robust, right? So I'd much rather have a tiny puzzle piece that I know replicates, that I know is robust, and having like one of these big predictors that we think is really explaining 50% of the variance of phenomena. Because if you think about human behavior, it's just so unlikely that we'll ever find something that kind of persists over time and explains that much variance. But also what that means is that we have to think about effect sizes a little bit differently. So I remember when I started out publishing, there were oftentimes voices who was like, oh, but it's not meaningful, because meaningful was always defined as a medium effect size. And I 100% agree that we should have a discussion of, is that actually something that's contributing to our understanding of the phenomena, or is it so negligible and so small that it doesn't matter? But like if we start thinking about this more in terms of predictive accuracy, in terms of robustness, and in terms of really like this more granular and nuanced puzzle piece of human behavior that we're trying to put together, I think it's an amazing opportunity. The third point, and this is interesting because it's speaking a little bit to the question that I saw that was posted by Catherine in the chat, is this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. And I think for me, this is the part that makes computational social science the most exciting, because you get to work with people across different disciplines. And I think what you posted in the chat, Catherine, is entirely right. So you can be a domain expert in psychology, in political science, in linguistics, whatever it is that you grew up in, the discipline that you grew up in. And then there's a way of kind of finding the right people to help you, for example, with running the analyses, with thinking through some of the ways in which you could actually use the data that's at your disposal in a way to answer those questions. And oftentimes it's not easy. So like the one thing that I always tell my students is that it's unlikely that you can be an expert in everything, right? If you're an economist, if you're a psychologist, then it's very unlikely that you ever get to this level, unless you want to totally transition, of like a computer scientist who's done their PhD in a specific context on social networks. But what you need to do, and I think that's what makes it interesting, is that you just have to speak the language of people. So you don't have to know every single step. You don't have to necessarily know the math behind it. If you do, that's amazing. But if you can speak the language, and then you can get the right people on board in my experience, it's oftentimes more fruitful than just trying to do everything yourself. And to some extent, I think what we need for this to happen more often is it's like our disciplines have to rethink the way that we're being incentivized on a tenure track, for example, where oftentimes in psychology, I see this in business schools, I know that's the same in economics. Oftentimes our institutions, they want as few authors on a paper as possible, right? Because it's like, well, how do we know that you contributed meaningfully to this paper? And when you think of computational social science, oftentimes there's many authors by definition, because you get the data set from a specific place. Then you have someone who runs the analysis, you have someone who brings the domain expertise. And most of the time it makes for an incredible paper, but it also means that there's a lot more authors on that paper that, again, like depending on how you can negotiate with your institution, makes it easier or harder to get the credit for the work that you've put in. But I do think this is changing, which also, and I think this is, which I should say, I do think it's changing gradually, which I'm very happy to see. It felt a little bit when I started that when you think of publication, it sometimes was like a little bit of an uphill battle. So either, because oftentimes the papers are interesting and the questions are interesting. So sometimes you get into one of the top journals just because it's novel, you have big data. But then also, like, if you don't make it into one of the top journals, it was oftentimes difficult to convince your own disciplinary journals to take it, because it was not psychology enough for the psychologists, but it was like not computational enough for the computer scientists. So I'm super excited to see that this is changing gradually. I think I might just stop here so that we have enough time for questions, but I just feel like there's so much to be excited about in that field. And I hope that many of you are gonna join the crew when it comes to computational social science.
Great, why don't I dive in? Thanks, Sandra, thanks, Duncan. I'll start where Sandra left off. This is a really great time to be a PhD student, and I honestly wish I could go back in time and be a PhD student again. Not just because I want the free pizza. There's a lot less free pizza as you get older. Also, you can't metabolize the pizza, so there's lots of reasons to want to be a grad student. But I think I'd love to be a grad student again, because it's very, very hard when you're in the midst of sort of a flowering of a field to realize that's what's happening. But having been in this field before and then seeing it happen, we're really in the midst of this explosion. And whatever you may think, I think the thing to remember in explosions is that when you think, oh, the big changes have already happened, that's just the beginning of the exponential curve. If you don't believe this, you should go back and read what people said about the internet in 2000. They're like, oh, I guess all this stuff had changed. I guess we haven't had yet Facebook, social media. Nothing. All of that hadn't happened. But in 2000, people were like, well, I guess the big explosion has happened. And so I think I want to start by just saying everything that we're saying, and I think the panelists would agree with me, this is a beginning. And part of what's exciting about beginnings is the chapters of the future are not written yet. And we're going to write them together. You're going to write them, different people are going to write them. And that's part of what's exciting for me. It's the unknown. And there's no way to read ahead and know who killed the butler or whatever it might be. So let me try and make this very concrete and talk about what I think the nature of the explosion is. And this is implicit in what's already been said. There are times when explosions happen in fields because there are domains and topics that become really interesting. In economics, for example, the idea of integrating psychological insights about people, behavioral economics became very big. But what we're seeing is a wholesale explosion caused by tools, by a capacity to analyze human beings in isolation and in systems in a way that we never had before. And the tools I have in mind here, very broadly, Duncan has mentioned almost all of them, but just to put it in perspective, by tools, I mean both data, as Sandra was emphasizing, I mean machine learning, agent-based modeling. It's just an explosion of tools. And tools-based explosions are interesting, and they have a properties to them that is worth understanding because it'll help us make sense of what's happening right now. So to make it concrete, let me talk about machine learning as a tool that has been, I think, exploded onto the scene and which we as social scientists can use. The first thing to realize is that whatever discipline you may have in, whatever walls they put up to try and prevent this stuff from happening, this type of what's happening right now is not too different than some tools-based explosions in the past. So economists, for example, it's always funny. I always feel like the odd person out because my identity is defined by everybody else. So since there's no economist here, now I have to be the economist. If there were an economist here, then they'd be like, which always makes me think, wait, if there were an economist here, they wouldn't trust me to be an economist. So what am I really saying? But anyway, no one's here to cross-check me, so I'll just plow right along. So economists, for example, had a suite of imperialism in the 90s and the 80s, which involved a certain kind of tool, the ability to mathematically model people using self-interest, rationality, et cetera, and people like Becker exploded onto the scene. Whatever you may think, it worked extremely well because it gave us insights we didn't have before. That was a sort of tools-based explosion. And I think we're seeing something here not too dissimilar, except instead of coming from one discipline, it's coming from actually quite a few places. It's sort of shrapnel is flying everywhere. It's kind of not imperialism, but sort of a lot of, this warfare metaphor is not going anywhere. I'm going to abandon it now. The thing I want to talk about is that I think when you have this type of explosion, there are a few things that structurally happen. So let's start with the first one. The first is we can get insights that spread across that expand past any one application. Because the question you always have to ask is, if the only thing that ties us together are our tools, then what truly ties us together? And that's a question you have to kind of ask. Every tools-based discipline has to say, wait, like when you have two people who work on discrimination, they have something to talk about. They have discrimination to talk about. They have the phenomena to bring them together. But when the only thing that ties two people together is we both use machine learning, then what ties us together? So I want to push us to say, well, if there is something cross-disciplinary here, part of what we want to look for is the insights that spread across any particular application, the insights we might be getting about people. And in my own work, I feel like I've seen that to a degree, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists in the discussion, what they've seen along those lines. The next point I'll raise is the obvious one. I put it second because I wanted to, the obvious one is there are insights about the tool itself that can be useful across areas. I think this is largely secondary, though at this early stage, it's very useful. It's secondary because it's not enough to ground a discipline ultimately, but I think it is very, very important. The final thing I'll say that can kind of, what are the sort of things that tie these things together is insights about the scientific method. And that's what I want to conclude on my conversation, my part of the discussion. What I mean by that is fields are not just defined by the problems they study or the tools they use. They're actually narrowly defined by what they define truth to be. And it's hard to see when you sit inside a field. I'm not making some meta comment about everything is relative. I literally mean, like, if I sit in a seminar and it is a seminar about discrimination and the data that's being presented, is the same data, and I'm surrounded by economists, what kinds of comments I can make about confounders are very different than the kind of comments I can make about what are the confounders if I'm surrounded by, say, sociologists. The data is the same. The results are the same. The only thing different is our agreed upon norms as to what constitutes truth. That is just an inherent feature of every discipline. There's no way around it. Every discipline wants to delude itself to the fact that that does not exist, but that does exist. Now, given that that exists, what ends up happening when you have these new tools is they can cause every discipline to shake itself up a little bit and be like, why are we measuring and deciding truth is established in this way? So to go back to my example of machine learning, let me illustrate how that can happen across all fields using that particular tool in computational social science. If you think of a simple supervised learning paradigm where you have X's and the model can infer Y hats, so you have X, Y, it predicts Y from X, and it has out of sample performance. Obviously, there are a lot of problems with that, but actually, let me pause on that with a lot of problems with that. I will just make one minor side observation. The side observation is every discipline has an incredible immune system. Incredible immune system. It is very powerful at taking invaders and attacking it. So when you see this thing that's prediction, like, well, this doesn't generalize to new data it's never seen. That's the immune system. But the problem with immune systems is they can also knock out something that's genuinely interesting and new, because everything has weaknesses. So the strength of machine learning is it's got this incredible way, and Sandra alluded to it, which is independent of me deciding how X should be turned into Y, which would be something theoretical, something I would make decisions about. An algorithm has with all the problems that are clear and true, has a capacity to turn its own X to Y hat. And there can be signal in that, and there can be information in that. How would we use that? So if you think about one thing that does, is it really puts prediction to the forefront of all of these activities. If you look in the last 20 years, prediction has receded in favor of causation. Causation, I mean, I've done a lot of work on causal inference. Causal inference is great. You change one X, how does Y change? That's a super important question. But it is only one of the two kinds of modes of analysis we have in social science. We have causation and we've got prediction. Neither is above the other, and both are interesting but different modalities of truth. If you look, say you go back to astronomy, if all you were interested was astronomy, well, you can't really run experiments in astronomy. You could run experiments on little objects in the world around you and make the grand leap to assume that the planets match whatever your little pendulum is doing. That's a grand leap. And Duncan has written about this, and but that is still a grand leap. In astronomy, actually in the oldest of these sciences, we focus on prediction. Why did my theory do well? It actually predicted the movement of Mars's orbit better than your theory. That's why it did well. And that is a standard for truth that has sort of waned a little bit. But I think with these tools, it's about to wax again, assuming that's what waxing, I have no idea if that's what, I just know wax and wane. I'm just assuming that's what that word means. So I think that's going to wax again, which opens up all sorts of awesome questions. What are the standards that we should be having for predictive truth? How does predictive truth relate to causal truth? And in particular, I think these questions are so important to social science because of the great big unspoken, the thing that no social scientist ever wants to talk about. We know it in the back of our head. We will deny it when you mention it to us, but it is the single biggest fact about social science that I think defines the field. We have no idea what the fuck is going on. When you look at the R squared of anything, it is tiny, tiny, like nothing. We don't understand these systems. So when you bring prediction to the forefront, it exposes one of the biggest problems in our field, which is interesting and which then raises the bar a little bit. With causal inference, you can hide behind things. You can say, well, when I did this reminder intervention, on average, I got this many more people to sign up for a savings program. Great. Now let's do the R squared on this. Oh, I see. Actually, it's actually quite fun. When we first did our machine learning projects, because you're used to working with computer sciences who work on problems where predictive accuracy is one, not because they're great, but because the problem is simple. Is there a dog in this photo? I mean, to get a predictive accuracy of 1 on that is hardly considered a breakthrough, but they're used to such problems. I remember one of the early PhD students, she came to me and said, oh yeah, the model's not working on this problem at all. And I'm like, why do you say that? So let's look at what's happening. She's like her first presentation of the results. She's like, oh, it's only like an AUC of 0.65. And I was like, let me just explain something to you. Suppose we were predicting stock prices using past data and you had an AUC of, there are lots of phenomena in the world where an AUC of 0.53 constitutes a major victory. And so I'll just conclude on that by saying, I think what's really exciting is that we have a situation where we're not just working on old problems with new tools. We're not just working on new problems, as Duncan alluded to, with new tools. We're actually going back and asking ourselves, how do we define what truth is? And that's a pretty exciting time to be in any discipline. All right, thank you.
Wow, thank you all. That was fantastic. So I want to remind everyone who is attending that we are going until 5:30. So don't worry, you don't just have 7 minutes to talk with these wonderful people. We have a little bit more time. We have some great questions already in the Q&A. I encourage people to post other questions. I think we'll start with Katie Keith, who has asked a question that I think the panelists have seen, but I'm going to, I hope, be able to unmute Katie so she can actually ask this question herself. Okay. Katie, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much. This was an incredible panel. I have a question that it seems like great computational social science research comes from this blend of domain experts from the social sciences with people who maybe have a really strong machine learning or computational statistics background. And so in your experience, what have been the best sort of mechanisms of forming these collaborations? And how do you strengthen these kind of matching that the field needs, and sort of what needs to happen for this to expand in computational social science?
I'm sure. I'll give the contrarian answer, Catherine, because it's just because it's right. I should have gone second. So I think the contrarian answer I'd give is that, and I'm only giving it because I completely agree with the base of your question. Getting more of these collaborations is great. But I just want to poke at one of the implicit understatements of that, which I think is useful, which is, I think that bilingual people are very, 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 very valuable in these early days. And I think, I won't speak for myself. It's not clear I know how to even speak one language, given my misunderstanding about wax and wane. But Sandra, Duncan, David, if you look at all of them, they have bilingualism in that they know the domain of some problems they're working on, but they also very much know the tool. And I think this is a great time, above and beyond collaborations, to encourage a sort of bilingualism where people can get very, very good at doing both areas. And the reason for that is that there's a lot that's lost in translation in moving from one mind to another. And in medicine, for example, I think a lot of bad papers that I see are by very good people in their individual disciplines and working in a team. And it's because there are handoff problems from the eminent physicians to the eminent computer scientists. And those handoff problems are hard to resolve without having both of those ideas sit in one head. So I would almost say that collaboration is awesome, but we need a lot of bilingualism as well.
And I mean, I think it's a super valid point. I think it depends a little bit on where you are in your career, right? So for me now, starting off from scratch, learning something that I've never seen before, that I don't understand at all, there's only so much time that I can dedicate to that. And there's only so much room that I have to grow in the time that I have. If you're a PhD student, that's your chance. And then I 100% agree with Sendhil, right? So what I tell and I think it kind of relates back to the way that we train our PhD students. Oftentimes what I see, and this is probably more true in the US than other places that I've been to, is that the students come in, there's so much pressure, they're in year one, they're like, when am I going to publish my first paper? And I'm like, you have 5-6 years, it's like amazing. You have the time to really own in on the method. So take the first year, take the second year to really build your toolkit. And don't just do it in your own discipline. Go to the computer science department, go to the engineering department. And oftentimes schools now have these interdisciplinary centers where you can be part of the Data Science Institute or the Computational Social Science Center. And I think as PhD students, also probably postdocs, this is your chance, right? Because then you can be at the center of this explosion. And one thing, if you're not a PhD student and you don't have that much time, one piece of advice that I recently heard from a colleague, which I thought was like so brilliant, is that like the way that you pick collaborators is essentially finding someone for whom their contribution is so easy and so self-explanatory that they don't even think they should be an author on the paper, right? So if something is incredibly difficult for you and you can find someone who's like, I can do this in 10 minutes, I don't think I should even be part of the paper, then that's like the perfect collaborator. So it probably depends a little bit on where you are in the process and how much time you have to dedicate to
that. I would try to split the difference between Sandra and Sendhil here, and I also, am a huge fan of collaborative research. but one thing that I've noticed in my own attempts to do this is that you know, the situation that Sandra just described is in some sense ideal, but typically it doesn't work out that way for me. That in fact you know, I have some problem and I get someone who I think knows, you know, something that I don't know about the methods. And then they say, oh, you know, I can do this. Here's what my method does. And I say, well, actually the answer to the question that I want. And so then we sort of go back and forth, you know, a number of times, potentially over a long period of time. And it becomes clear that the sort of existing off-the-shelf method doesn't work, right? It sort of almost works. And if you kind of don't really interrogate it carefully, and if you squint your eyes enough, you could sort of get by, and you could probably publish a paper in which you do the thing that's not quite the right thing, and you know, it would look like a productive interdisciplinary collaboration, but you haven't really answered the question, and that turns out to be like not just a bit harder, but a lot harder, right? Because now you have to basically generate, you know, you have to modify the method, or you have to invent an entirely new method. And so now it's not a 10-minute fix, it's like a 2-year fix. And so this sort of what I refer to as deep interdisciplinarity, right, is you know, a lot more costly to invest in, right, and runs into all the problems like the one that Sandra just mentioned, where you have some expectation of, you know, publishing some, you know, several articles a year in order to get your first job. It's tough to sort of commit to something like that. But I think, you know, we need to figure out ways in which to incentivize that kind of engagement. And sometimes it happens in centers and you know, in research groups. And I certainly try to kind of give my students, you know, running room to develop those kinds of collaborations. But it's a challenge, you know. And then just sort of very quickly, I would say one organization that I think is doing a good job of bringing people together and having them sort of become friends and collaborators and you know, working together for years in the subsequently is the Summer Institutes on Computational Social Science, which Matz and Chris Bale started at Princeton in 2017, and I mentioned that briefly in my talk. You know, I think that's like a very concrete attempt to try to sort of help solve this problem by, you know, essentially creating, you know, social bonds between people from these different disciplines who will then, you know, spend years working together subsequently. So I think it can be done, but I think it can be tricky.
Let me add one thing. I really like those comments, and if I were to integrate them together, I hadn't thought of, well, I like the phrase deep interdisciplinary, and I love the challenges, the way you put it, Duncan. And I liked one thing you said, Sandra, which was just great. And it made me wonder if that's all it is. Once you said it, I was like, oh, this is a solution I've seen executed very well, given all the constraints you raised, which is grad students have the incentives and the time to be bilingual. And I have seen a few interdisciplinary collaborations work very well when they are held together by the staple of a grad student who's empowered and encouraged to be bilingual. And they view their job as actually really getting an expertise at both of the, say, the faculty teams that they're working with. I've seen that work extremely well because it's a way for the PI on each side to kind of talk well. And I've even seen some senior researchers be like, yeah, no, I start with the grad student and it's got to be good. And that's very interesting. I never thought, I kind of at the back of my head, but I hadn't put 2 and 2 together. It's a great approach.
Thank you. We're going to turn to a question, apologize for pronunciation, from Mehdi Nelamarka. And I will unmute. There we go.
So hello and greetings from Helsinki, and sorry for the really weird name, but it was actually quite nice pronunciation of my version of it. So something on top of the interdisciplinarity, something that I'm always interested is that sometimes when we speak about computational social science, it seems that we are speaking of new emerging disciplines. And then some work seems to be more sort of being integrated into existing social sciences and using these methods, but actually being about political science or being sociology or being communication studies or whatever. So where do you think that we are in this sort of area between these two things? And if you could shape the society or shape the science, what would be the desirable outcome? Like where should we put these between this sort of quite naive, but sort of dimension of being its own and being completely integrated into everything else?
It's a really interesting question. We've had a lot of discussions about this over the years in the context of should we create a journal of computational social science, and it's exactly this question, right? Do we want to have a place where all of this research that is sort of high quality research when judged on its own merits, but sometimes difficult to publish in field journals because it's sort of, as Sandra said, it's not quite psychology, it's not quite computer science. It's sort of appealing to think, oh, let's have a journal where we can put all that stuff, and then everyone who's interested can read that journal. And the counter argument has always been, yes, but then we end up sort of segregated, and we become this sort of sort of second-rate field. And we don't have impact back in the primary disciplines. And so maybe we should not have a journal and force ourselves to try to publish in field journals and try to influence them to become more computational and to change what they want and their preferences. And so I think that we're sort of doing that right now, and we're trying to have a little bit of our cake and eat it by making the conference more of this, like everyone comes together and we all exchange ideas. So we have this sort of jamboree style conference where anyone can submit a paper. It's not archival. It can be research that is under review somewhere or already published or completely or not finished. Everything is submitted as an extended abstract. So everything is sort of, everyone has to make a bit of an effort. And it's very big tent, right? And everybody, it's all about getting together and sharing ideas. But then when it comes to publishing, we don't have that. We have to kind of do the work of trying to publish in other people's journals. So, but, I don't know if that's the right thing to do. That's sort of what we're doing right now. Maybe the answer is that none of us could be bothered to start a journal because we didn't want to run a journal. There's a lot of journals in the world, and it's hard to start a new one, and it's hard to make it comparable to the existing top journals. So anyway, that's where we are.
I can, if I would, I have two comments. One is a question, actually back to you, Sandra, because I was struck by the point you made about how, there's a tension in publishing, all or none. It's like you get into science and my first is actually this question based on what Duncan said back to you, like, what would be your view? Like, do you think it would help if there were a committed journal, or it would not really help because psychologists would be like, I don't know what this is. You publish in something, I don't know what it is.
I do think that at the moment, it will probably be the latter. I think right now, if it doesn't fit onto your list of 5 journals that are accepted as the A-tier journals, it's super hard to convince them, like even just convincing them that computer science proceedings are real publications. It's just, you have to take this extra step of explaining it. So when you have letter writers, you can't reach out to every single letter writer and explain it. But I do think that, and I think you can see some of the journals are doing this. So some of the journals, and I'm coming from the psych world, right? So we have a social and personality psychology journal who now has a specific new desk that is dedicated to big data. And I think as soon as that happens, you have like your little niche in a journal that's dedicated to that question and that gives those studies priority. And for me, that's probably the most promising way because it allows you to walk in both worlds, which is also why I think, I mean, journals is one thing, conferences I think is the other. Because what I love about the field is that it allows me to walk in both worlds, right? I love my psychology conferences where we can talk about the specific topics, we can talk about like mechanisms, we can talk about how does that fit into the broader field of psychology. But then there's also these conferences that I can go to and I can talk about the methods and I can see how do people in other disciplines, they're asking similar questions, how are they tackling the challenges that I see in my field. So I think for me, journals is one thing, but then conferences is just the place that's fun and where I probably learn the most.
That's great. These are some just fantastic questions. I'm really impressed by things that are showing up and of course all of the answers. The next question we have is coming from Purva Pruthi, who I think I can allow to talk now. Yep.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you everyone for the wonderful talk. It was really nice. So the question I have is, what are some examples where conclusions from computational social science studies drive the decision making and provide feedback like to the real systems? And the reason I ask this question because insights from studies can be on the scale of like large data on an average, what we see, but decision making might be at very individual level. So where does the balance lie?
I can give an example, and it's a great question, Purva, because it actually illustrates what I think one of the power of the new tools is, which is we now have so much. I mean, when you think statistical analysis, I think you're right to think analysis of aggregates, and I think that has largely been true. But I think if you look at statistical analysis today, both because of the scale and scope of data, but also because of machine learning and other tools, it's no longer an analysis of aggregates in the sense of aggregating across people. So just to put it in perspective, if we were to study emailing behavior and how people tend to email, keep in mind that your data set, just your data set of emails that you've sent and received, and all of that made up data. I don't know what it is for yours, but I've done it for my data set. My data set is roughly the size of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. So there are better astronomy data sets now, but my data set was the size of the universe in one sense, of the narrow sense of the word. We have individuated data that is ginormous. And as a result, because of that, and because the tools actually allow you to make analysis that are highly specific and precise, the insights that can follow from them can be highly actionable to the individual at hand. So to give a concrete example, imagine we did an analysis which we said, hey, I noticed that people respond using more terse language when responding to, let's say, people below them in the hierarchy than people above them in the hierarchy. And you could look at that and say, that's not the person I want to be. But as you point out, Purva, that sounds like an aggregates finding. But guess what? We could make that statement about you. You tend to respond to these people. So that individuation of these kind of insights is very, very powerful. And I think I'm using the email as just a toy example, but it shows up in many, many contexts. We've done work on doctors, for example, making decisions. And you can get unbelievable insights back to the individual level doctor that helps them shape how they make their decisions about who should get tested for heart attack. You can get general insights. For example, we find that you can find out about what is the psychological bias individual doctors have about testing for heart attack. You find, oh, this is the kind of information they omit. That's actionable advice you can send back to every doctor, which is you tend to omit this kind of information. So I think we now, with these tools, the divide between the aggregate and the individual is far more fluid.
Anyone else want to take that on, or I think that's good? Okay. We will.
I think it's funny because I interpreted the question in a slightly different way, and I think you actually got the right interpretation. So my initial response was like, it's a question about like, we have all these aggregate level insights, but at the end of the day, right, it's like a person, like a policymaker, kind of making the decision of what to do with these findings, which to me is an equally interesting question, right? Because it says like, is there any benefit that we have with big data to convince people who then make the decisions of what to do with it compared to traditional paradigms? And I do think that there oftentimes is, right? So by definition, the fact that data is coming from the real world and we can test it in a way that is looking at phenomena as they play out in daily life puts us in a much better spot of saying, look, here's something that we found. Again, we don't know entirely how stable it is, but we're focusing on prediction. It's not just that we come up with like some interesting theory and we show that it's causal. It works in the real life. It is to some extent predictive. And then oftentimes what you can also do, and it's, so I think Sendhil, you took it to the extreme, which I think is super interesting, because you can say, we can look at every single individual, but the beauty of big data to some extent is that you, even if it's not a representative sample, which the criticism that you oftentimes get is like, oh, there's like, you're undersampling people age 65 plus. There's still oftentimes a super large population of people 65 plus. So you can look at these different heterogeneous effects across the different strata of society. And I think if we're thinking about it in terms of having evidence to back up policy decisions, to back up these individual decisions that happen in kind of government, in organizations, we're in a much better place as social scientists than we used to be when we had our lab studies and just experimental work.
Yeah, I think the heterogeneous treatment effect is really an important observation. And I remember there was an example from several years ago now. It's, I think Sinan Aral and some colleagues at Facebook were looking at the effect of social influence on advertising, and they have this sort of beautiful plot in their figure where the average effect is actually 0, right? But it's an average over a lot of negative effects and a lot of positive effects. So the sort of individual level effect is like actually not 0 for most people, but the sign flips depending on the sort of the nature of the tie between individuals. And if you were just like doing the standard average treatment effect analysis, you would totally miss that. So I think that that kind of insight can be useful. I don't know whether it's sort of that's in deployment at Facebook somewhere. My guess is it is. But a lot of these applications that you're asking about probably are happening in industry.
So the next question comes from Shemek Grabovich about the prediction and causal inference question. Oops, Shemek.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the very exciting discussion. I want to make a question with respect to what Sendhil mentioned about the two potential approaches to computational social science problems, basically predictive models or causal studies. It could be causal discovery models, for instance. And my question is whether those two approaches are or could be made compatible. So for instance, in causal discovery, you see that certain algorithms in causal discovery are score-based, and the score is basically an information criteria. Some of this information criteria estimate predictive accuracy. And in fact, in philosophy of science, there have been some work suggesting that this kind of information criteria could lead to how theories are discovered about nature or humans in this case. So I wonder what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think I'll give a two-part answer. I think part one, you're 100% right. There are huge complementarities. You've given one, which is, let me summarize, assuming I've gotten it right. In a lot of sort of propensity score matching estimators, you have to decide what the matching function is. That matching function is effectively a prediction problem. And there's some nice papers that do that. Another one, which Duncan alluded to when he talked about heterogeneous treatment effects, once you have a random assignment or something you're willing to believe is random assignment, the estimator of heterogeneous treatment effects is actually equivalent to a prediction problem. So both of those things, you're exactly right, there's complementarity. But let me push back a little bit, and one thing that makes me uneasy about those complementarities. What makes me uneasy about them is that they have predictions serving as the handmaiden to questions and truth as defined by causal inference. So we're going to do what we've always done, causal inference. Hey, maybe prediction can come in and help out a little bit. And that's good, I mean, that's great. But I think for there to be, now I feel like I'm in Star Wars, for there to be real balance in the Force, it feels like prediction has its own intrinsic logic and its own intrinsic nature of what constitutes truth. And I think I love this first kind of work, but I think we have a large portion to go. And I think the complementarity I would seek out of these two modes of exploration are really come from the recognition that they are discovering two different kinds of truth. One is the kind of truth that arises around actions we might take in the world. The other is a kind of truth that arises around how much have we understood about the phenomena that we're describing. And those are just very different. And not every phenomenon is actionable. So I do think they are, it's up to you to decide how you want to integrate them. But anyway, I'll stop there.
I agree with that, and I would like to give a concrete example of how a predictive approach can actually lead to a novel ways of developing like substantive theory, and this relates to a point Sandra made earlier about how sort of traditional approaches to theory testing really start with a theory that comes from psychology or from economics or whatever. And then you design an experiment, say, to test that particular theory, and you actually make a whole bunch of choices about your experiment that exclude other things from affecting the result. And this is sort of considered to be, the sort of, the desirable way to design an experiment. But if you then think about what you're doing, there's some large space of possible experiments that you could have designed where all of the different parameters can be varied. So now you're in some very high dimensional space of all possible experiments, and you've picked one point in that space, right? And you're testing your theory at that one point, and then you're just sort of hoping that whatever you conclude generalizes to other points in that space, but you can't actually go and test all of those other points, or you're not even trying to do that, right? Because your whole sort of mindset is about zeroing in on one of those points. Now it's possible to kind of flip the whole thing on its head and say, let's first write down this space of all all the parameters that I could vary, and now systematically search that space and run hundreds or thousands of experiments, and then I can use machine learning to develop to build models that predict in an out of sample way outcomes across this entire space, and then try to reconcile those machine learning models with existing substantive theory. And so this is exactly the approach that Tom Griffiths and his colleagues at Princeton have been using recently to in the context of risky gambles, like decision making under uncertainty, and so they can sort of recover the existing theories as special cases of this sort of general model that applies much more generally than any of the existing theories. But it's sort of mind-blowing in the sense that it's like totally the opposite way of thinking about theory development, where instead of starting with your theory and then designing your experiment and then getting your data, you start with the data and then you infer the theory from the data. And so, I'm very excited about this way of doing things, which, you know, requires doing, you know, sort of experiments on a vastly larger scale than we have thought about in the past. But prediction is like really at the center of it, being able to sort of, you know, evaluate what you know and what you can explain in terms of what you can predict. So I think there's, you know, as Sendhil mentioned in his remarks earlier, like this is the kind of like big structural change that we could see happening as a result of, you know, computational methods being applied to social science.
Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question. And for me, it's almost like prediction is step number one, right? So it's almost, to me, it just helps me to think about what is worth my effort of then following up with experiments. So if I find an interesting relationship and I know it's predictive, I know it's a phenomena that is out there, now I can decide that this is worth my time and I can follow up in experiments and I can try to show that it's causal and I can try to test the mechanisms. But it kind of gives me this confidence that it's actually an effect that matters and it's robust and we see it again and again and again in the real world. So for me, it's almost the opposite in the sense that it comes first and then we can think about how do we use our traditional methods to just kind of open the box and look at it from different angles.
All right, we're going to go back to Katie Keith, who has another question that's been upvoted. So Katie.
Yeah, thanks. Duncan, I really like what you said about large-scale digital trace data being really essential to good CSS work. And so I was wondering if the panelists could describe their most successful efforts to gain access to such large-scale digital trace data and what has worked and has not worked from a very practical sense.
Do you mean industry?
Just like any large-scale digital trace data. I guess it could be industry, but also government, also, you know, individuals giving up their data, running really large-scale experiments. I guess just like practical experiences that the panelists have had.
So if I can interject, Duncan, I remember walking with you some years ago in Arlington, Virginia, to a meeting, and I said, "Why are you going to Yahoo?" And you said, "Because they've got tons of data and I can make a big impact by using it." At least that was my recollection of your.
Yes. So my answer is that in my case, I spent 12 years working in industry, you know, more or less for that reason. You know, everything turns out to be, you know, messier than you imagine it's going to be. So there's lots of problems, but yes, that's one way to do it, right? Is go work for the companies that have the data. I wish that you didn't have to do that, but that there's certainly a lot of really interesting, innovative research that is coming out of, you know, places like Facebook, but also, and once upon a time Yahoo and Microsoft. But also like places that you might not expect, like Netflix and Uber and Booking.com. You know, they're very, very thoughtful and do very interesting work because they have, you know, access to data and also the ability to run experiments. So I think that, you know, that's not a, you know, that's. It might sound like a little bit of an extreme step to say, I'll go work in industry, but I think, you know, there are lots of very interesting careers in industry.
And I think there's some, I wish there was a silver bullet. I'm still looking for that. I don't think there is one, because like once you're in industry, obviously there's other limitations that you can't always talk about the stuff that you want to talk about. And if you're lucky enough to get one of these positions, that's great. But so I've tried a couple of things, and it's a bit of a hit or miss, depending on what you're looking for. So oftentimes you can actually, if universities have specific centers, so Columbia, for example, they have a data science institute and they have companies associated with the data science institute. So I oftentimes just go through the list of companies and see if there's any companies that stand out in terms of the data that they have that they might be able to provide, and have been pretty successful in that case, just because they already have the structure set up. So oftentimes it takes forever to put data sharing agreements in place with companies, and you have to get the legal team of the university to kind of establish something. If there's a center that already deals with that and has companies associated, it's much easier. So I would just kind of see if there's an opportunity there. I've also tried collecting my own data. The lab that I did my PhD in back in Cambridge in the UK, they had like one of the biggest data sets on psychological kind of questionnaires associated with Facebook data. And I know that a few people have been successful in doing that. So you put out a questionnaire and you try to make it entertaining, and you kind of try to give something back to participants that's not money, but it's self-insight. For me, that's mostly a miss. So I think you just have to be lucky for that to work. I wouldn't, if it was a recommendation to one of my PhD students, I would not have them gamble on that option. I think that worked nicely in the beginning. It's a gamble that I don't think you necessarily want to take. I oftentimes approach relatively small companies. So there's research that I do on well-being and mental health in relation to smartphone sensing data. And it's hard to approach Google and ask them to get their Google Health data, which would be amazing, but it's just like you have so many hurdles to jump over. If you can identify smaller startups in this space, they're oftentimes much more willing to share data, right? Because then they have the credibility that's coming from an institution. They might be interested in gaining insights into what their data actually tells them. So if you think about the trade-off between big institutions, they might have the most amazing data, but there's smaller institutions like startups that might be more willing to share data, and that might just make it easier to establish these collaborations in the first place.
Let me just build on that last thing, because I love what you said there, Sandra. It's just, you know, if you look at places like Facebook, Google, they've got scale in both senses. They've got a bunch of data scientists, they've got a bunch of data, but I think there are two kinds of companies that are worth targeting and that I found incredibly responsive. One is small companies where they have data scientists, but they don't have the human capital to look at their data. And you'd be amazed at how excited they are to have you involved. The other is large, old economy, quote unquote, companies. You would think the Gap must have tons of, but the Gap would love, I mean, there's sort of, they would love to, I'm not saying the Gap per se, but you know, companies of that ilk, and they've got tons of data that they're, I mean, tons of data, you know, it is not, and so to build on Sandra's advice, I think it was quite a while before I learned that, because academia doesn't teach you to do this, I learned that you can just do a cold call, and you can just do 50 cold calls, and who cares if 48 of them are not returned? 2 people will now talk to you and are happy to work with you. You only need 1 or 2 anyway. And so just like you do in lots of sales cycles, just literally getting, it takes, for me, it took a mental shift of like, it's just okay to reach out. And as Sandra mentioned, like there are all alumni from universities that are in all sorts of places. You can use the alumni, and you'd be amazed at how high a hit rate you get. You know, 20% hit rate is great. You just have to do 10 calls and you get 2. So I think I would second that and encourage you to do that.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that is unfortunately our last question. There are many more questions, but I encourage people to mail our panelists, or you know, I hope we will have some follow-up session at some point. I want to thank each of you. You have done wonderful things and said fantastic advice and thoughts and concepts, and it's just been a real pleasure to hear all of this. And thank you so much for attending, and I thank you to everyone, all of our attendees who have been asking great questions. Wonderful. I think we're concluded. Thank you so much.